Welcome to your first chapter of Human Physiology. This is Rachel Ulrich, and I will try not to bore you to death. Chapter 1, it's Intro to Physiology. It's not the most riveting chapter in the book, but we need to lay some groundwork, review some biology and anatomy information that we're going to be building upon. And so we're going to get started. All right. Here's the thing. Most people are interested in human physiology, particularly because they want to do a job that takes care of humans, right? We need to understand human physiology in order to help keep humans healthy, their teeth clean, give them the right medications. We have all these jobs in the healthcare field that have to do with humans, and we need to know about what's going on, right? So we have this organism here, the human, right? So here's the human. But the human really is a bunch of organ systems doing their jobs within the same human. They're doing their jobs separately, but it's really to maintain the human. And these, they don't do them in a silo. The cardiovascular system is not in a silo. It doesn't just do its thing. The cardiovascular system is the heart pumping blood through the arteries and veins. But there's no point in pumping blood if you're not getting new oxygen into the blood and taking the carbon dioxide out of the blood. So really, you also need the respiratory system in order to make the cardiovascular system functioning. And all these things are working, being regulated by the nervous system, being regulated by the endocrine system, which is the hormones, and so on and so forth. So all of these organ systems are doing their jobs, but they're interrelated. At kind of the foundation of each organ system are usually the organs themselves. And what makes up an organ are groups of tissues. And what makes up groups of tissues are cells. And so we can look at the smallest functional unit, which is the cell. The cell is the smallest functional unit. It's doing a specific job. If the cells are doing their job correctly, and they're doing them in groups, making sure that it's a nice organized group of cells doing a function, we then call it a tissue. Tissues are groups of cells and their surrounding matrix or interstitial fluid. That's the fluid that is surrounding the cells in a tissue bed. There are 4 primary tissue types. When all of these tissues are working together to perform a common function, we now call it an organ. And when organs work in tandem, like I said, you have the heart, you have blood, and you have the blood vessels. We now call it a cardiovascular system, right? So it's an organ system at that point. And so if you can look at it from the smallest to the biggest, you can look at it from the smallest to the biggest on this one, where we're talking about, hey, the correct molecules have to join in the correct way in order to form a functioning protein, right? You have enough functioning proteins, they form structures. And if these structures are working together with a cell membrane around it, doing a function, now we just call it a cell. And when cells work together in groups, we call it a tissue. And when you have multiple tissue types all working together, we call it an organ. And now when you have that organ working with the arteries, veins, and the blood getting pumped by the heart, it's now the cardiovascular system. So why am I mentioning all this? Well, really, if you don't have the smallest functional unit, the cell, working properly, you are not going to have a properly functioning tissue. And if you don't have properly functioning tissue, you don't have a properly functioning organ, and so forth. So really in physiology, the cell matters. And so we start with the cell. We're going to talk about cell membranes. We're going to drill down into all the parts of the cell, because They have to be doing their job. And if they don't do their job, then the tissue goes, the organ system, and ultimately the organism. And so that's why we tend to use diabetes. It's not only an epidemic, it really illustrates that hierarchical structure, that if the cell is not functioning properly, eventually tissues go down, organ systems and organisms. So it's a timely disease, but it's also a great illustration of this organization, right? We have trillions of cells in our body. It starts out, a couple of mesenchymal stem cells that are going to differentiate into different cells with different shapes and different features and completely different functions. So your first lab is going to be looking at cells under the microscope. We're going to be looking at epithelial cells, connective cells, and we're going to talk about these cells, right? You're even going to swab some of your own cells. Cells are super important. One thing that makes them be able to do their job effectively and efficiently is having a cell membrane control what is inside the cell from what is outside the cell. So what's outside the cell, the fluid that surrounds cells, is actually called interstitial fluid. Interstitial fluid is the fluid that surrounds cells. It's extracellular fluid. There is a different type of extracellular fluid, and that is plasma. That is the fluid inside blood. So you really do have two types of extracellular fluid. You have plasma, the fluid inside blood, and you have interstitial fluid, which surrounds cells. In some cases, it could be a matrix. It could be solid. In the case of bones, you have osteocytes or bone cells. It's surrounded by mostly inorganic phosphate crystals. And so we call it a matrix instead of a fluid. But most of the cells in our body are surrounded by interstitial fluid. There are four, like I said, four primary tissue types. Epithelial is a lining tissue. Lines the outside of things and the inside of things. You have connective tissue. Connective tissue really comes in three different categories: connective tissue proper, fluid connective tissue, and supporting connective tissue. This is really important if you get into further into physiology or physical therapy, or going on further in some kind of healthcare field. Connective tissue properly connects two things. So we're talking ligaments and tendons. They're actually connecting two things. Fluid connective tissue is blood and lymph. Lymph fluid comes from the blood fluid, and this is a fluid connective tissue. And the last is supporting connective tissue. These are your cartilages. And so they support things. Bones are also supporting connective tissue. Cartilage sits between two bones. It's actually not connecting the bones. It's just supporting space between bones, shock absorption. It's supporting. Bones themselves don't connect anything. They're actually attached to one another with ligaments. Tendons connect muscle to bone to make a move. So muscle produces movement. And skeletal muscle makes bones move, right? So this is skeletal muscle. It's going to make your bones move. But you also have smooth muscle, which moves things through tubes. And you have cardiac muscle, which is your heart, and it pumps blood. Smooth muscle pushes stuff through tubes. So real basic physiology here. We'll talk about muscles in depth when we get into muscle physiology, as well as the nervous system. So nerve tissue, it generates and conducts, electrical currents. And so that's going to turn on and off muscles and make us move, amongst other things. These next couple of slides just kind of go over the overview, right? So epithelium is going to line the inside or the outside of things. So your skin, right? You have your epidermis. That's the outside layer of your skin. It's epithelium, but it can also line the inside of things. Now, when it lines the inside of a hollow organ or vessel, say like an artery, we call that interior space a lumen. So a lumen is the interior, and if I could only spell, that would be great. Interior space equals lumen. It's where blood is located, or if it's the small intestines of your digestive tract, it's where your food that is being digested is located. It's the inside of the tube. So epithelium lines the inside of the tube, and it helps really decide what gets across the barrier of that tube into the body, or if it stays inside the tube. When we talk about digestion, we'll talk about brush border enzymes. Brush border enzymes are going to be on the epithelial cells lining the inside of the small intestine. And if they have the right enzyme, like lactase, you can separate lactose, which is milk sugar, and you can absorb it across the epithelial layer into the body. If you don't have that enzyme, lactase, you're lactose intolerant. And so the lactose sugar stays inside the lumen, can't be absorbed into the body. And again, that's just an example of epithelium functioning, really as a transport membrane, allowing things in or out. Epithelial tissue also is your glands. You have exocrine glands. Exo means to exit or leave body. So sweat is coming from an exocrine gland. It's going to go to your skin. It's going to evaporate your skin off your skin. It's going to leave your body. Salivary glands that get secreted into your digestive tract never get reabsorbed back into the body, these salivary enzymes. And so they leave with the fecal matter out of your digestive tract. So it exits out. So exocrine glands are producing enzymes for digestion, sweat, sebaceous glands, mammillary, milk, different types of things that will eventually exit your body. Endocrine, endo means inside. So it's going to secrete things that stay inside your body. So this is going to be your hormones, right? Hormones get secreted into the blood, and then it stays in your bloodstream until they're broken down. So they never leave your body. So it's endocrine. Connective tissue, most diverse. Again, you have your fluid connective tissue, you have your sporting connective tissue, you have your connective tissue proper, and then you have your muscles, example of skeletal muscle, example of cardiac muscle, and example of smooth muscle, right? Lining the stomach, mixing the contents. And then you have your nervous system, and we're going to talk about this when we get to the second unit. It's all about the nervous system. I would go through and kind of review the organ systems, some of the organs that make up those organ systems and their basic function, and write these out. It's great to have a kind of a general view of where we're going. So when we start talking about these things, it's not brand new. Okay, so this external internal exchange. It's really important to know that you have the external environment, right? And so we're talking air, food, right? You want these things to come into the body. And so they're coming from the external environment, and you're going to bring it into the body, and it's going to eventually get into the plasma of the blood. And it's traveling in the plasma of the blood, and oxygen, nutrients are going to leave the plasma of the blood, and then it's going to go into the interstitial fluid. So the interstitial fluid is the tissue fluid. And that is what ultimately exchanges with the cell. So cells exchange with interstitial fluid. That's what the cells are exchanging, right? And so it's going to take oxygen and it's going to get rid of its CO2, right? So CO2 is going to go this way and then this way into the respiratory tract, right? And it's going to leave the body. Bye-bye. Food, on the other hand, food's coming in, gets broken down, gets into the interstitial fluid and makes it in the cells. So cells have glucose and energy. Yay. So when it says in nutrients and oxygen, that's really what we're talking about. Now, the cells get rid of their waste, right? So it's glucose is coming in, waste is leaving, right? So waste is going that way. Bye-bye, urinary system takes care of the waste. And you urinate, right? Get rid of the waste. So when you look at this diagram, it's a little funky at first, I will admit. But what it's really trying to show you is you have the respiratory tract. And it's all about getting air inside and carbon dioxide out. So this is the external environment, and we're bringing it into the lungs to exchange with the interstitial fluid and then across, and we're bringing oxygen in here, and we're getting rid of the CO2. CO2 is leaving, and there's an example of exchange between the internal environment and the external environment in the respiratory tract. The other example they have here is digestive, right? So this is the digestive tract. You're eating food. Food gets broken down, right? And as it gets broken down, digestion, it's going to get absorbed again to the interstitial fluid and then into the blood. And then it can travel, right? It's going to travel, heart's pumping it, pump, pump. And now it can exchange between the interstitial fluid into the cell, and the cell can get rid of its waste products. And so here's where you also have exchange, because it's coming from external into the internal. Now, when you have this waste, you need to get rid of this waste. This waste gets exchanged and put back into the blood. And now you have the urinary system, which filters the blood. And gets rid of the waste. And that waste that we get rid of is called urine. So there's excretion. So it's a different kind of exchange, right? It's coming from internally, it's getting put into an external organ system, the urinary system, these nephrons that are creating urine. And then you're ultimately going to send that urine filtrate to the bladder, and then from the bladder out of the body. So again, you're going to see these examples of exchange. So tissue fluid is interstitial fluid. It is the fluid that surrounds cells. You need to remember this. Plasma is the fluid around the blood cells, or another way to say the fluid portion of blood. So these are two different types. So the two types of extracellular fluid. So two types of extracellular fluid. You have interstitial fluid, that's fluid surrounding cells, and you have plasma, that's the blood fluid portion of your blood. That's fluid that's outside the cells. Fluid that's inside the cells is intracellular fluid. Intracellular fluid. So the fluid that is inside these cells, if the fluid's inside, it is intra, because it's inside cellular fluid. And so there's exchange going on between the external environment and the plasma, which is an extracellular fluid, and then between the extracellular fluid of plasma with the interstitial fluid, and then with the exchange with intracellular fluid. right? So this is an exchange with extracellular fluid. And it's really important because cells want to really protect and control what's inside them from what's outside of them, right? So intracellular fluid has to be very different than extracellular fluid. And we're really going to get into these nuances as we move into physiology specifically. This is reviewing, again, there's external exchange between the respiratory tract or lungs, sorry. So this is respiratory. This is gastrointestinal tract, and this is urinary, right? So urinary system. Review these terms. Review absorption and secretion, write out the definitions. Absorption is bringing something from the external into the body. Secretion is taking something from within the body and getting rid of it to the external, right? So these are very different. Absorption is bringing into body, and secretion is basically having a substance leave. You can secrete things out of cells. You can secrete things into the urine filtrate. So secretion can be used a different couple of ways. When we talk about the urinary system, we'll talk about filtration, reabsorption of nutrients, secretion back into the urine filtrate, and ultimately excretion. These are terms we're also going to be using further down the road. This simplification is really just to kind of show you an oversimplification of how there's separation of intracellular fluid from extracellular fluid, from plasma, from the external environments, and so forth. Total body water, most of your water is going to be intracellular because you have trillions of cells. So if you look at all the water inside, all the intracellular fluid inside all those different cells, it really adds up to a whole lot more than interstitial fluid and plasma, which are the extracellular fluids, or ECF. Membranes compartmentalize cells, and so you can see that 28 liters of your body's fluid is intracellularly in all those trillions of cells, where extracellular is interstitial fluid and plasma combined to form that 14. Maintaining the difference in fluid composition across the cell membrane is super important. So we're going to talk about this. If the cell membrane no longer functions, the cell is going to suffer. Again, an example of this with diabetes. Type 2 diabetes, there is a breakdown in the mechanism to get glucose from the blood into the cell. So the cell can't really maintain the composition of what it needs and wants intracellularly. And extracellularly is also not going right because you can't get that excess sugar or glucose out of the blood into the cell. So the person ends up with high blood sugars. It's bad for the cell, it's bad for the human. And so really the cell needs to be able to regulate what comes in, what goes out, in order to maintain their function. This is another way to look at it, and this is kind of showing you ICF is intracellular fluid. It is exchanging with the interstitial fluid. Interstitial fluid is exchanging with the plasma of the blood. Plasma in the blood is what supplies the organs, and different organs can exchange with the external environment versus internal environment. So exchange and communication among cells is really important for homeostasis. Okay, so what you're going to find, I'm kind of got a smattering of questions in this PowerPoint, and then you got a little quiz afterwards. See if you're actually watching the lectures, because I know it might be tempting to skip them. But it is part of this class, and you are expected to watch these lectures. So you can go through these, and it does tell you the answers to all of these. This PowerPoint is available to you. You don't have to go through these with me. But so I'm going to kind of skip through them because these are easy ones. When we get to tougher ones, like what is the term for the fluid that is located outside the cell and it's found in the blood? So hoping that you're going to answer plasma, right? Because that's the fluid in the blood. Versus what is the term for the fluid that's outside the cell and found outside of the blood? So it's not the blood, it's outside the blood. And so I'm hoping that you're going to think interstitial fluid, because we just went through that. Okay, let's pick up with homeostasis. Homeostasis, you should have learned this in biology. It's basically trying to keep things the same, but nothing ever stays the same, right? Life is never the same. Relationships are never the same. Even the way we feel about things doesn't stay the same. They're dynamic. They're constantly changing. Well, our body really wants to keep things kind of the same. And so when sugar levels go up, like you just drink a large soda, all the sugar comes into your blood. There are little receptors in the beta cells of the pancreas that are monitoring this, and the sugars go way up, glucose goes way up in the blood. And now it's out of homeostasis, right? It's high. And so these receptors are going to then trigger the pancreas to release the hormone insulin into the bloodstream. Now, insulin's job is to store things, get it out of the bloodstream into storage. And so insulin will be released, and its job is to lower blood glucose levels or blood sugar levels. It does it by binding to a receptor on the outside of the cells to have sugar go into the cells. If there's someone with type 2 diabetes, that mechanism is broken, so the glucose stays high in the cell. But in a normal functioning human, insulin binds to the receptor on the cell membrane. A channel protein is inserted. Glucose can now go into the cell, brings the glucose levels of the blood back down to a normal level. Homeostasis is reestablished. If it doesn't happen, like in the case of type 2 diabetes, then we call it pathophysiology. It's not correct. It's pathological. So homeostasis refers to the ability to maintain a relatively constant internal environment. And our body is trying to keep everything constant over a period of time. Yes, things go up and down here and there, but it's within a range, right? Homeostasis requires all of the organs systems to integrate, and they got to work together. So, what's in our interstitial fluid is really determined by what's being exchanged between the cells. And what's in the interstitial fluid is determined by what's in the plasma. And what's in the plasma really determines what, the organ systems have. And so you can think of it as like what you put into your body is really going to determine what makes it into your blood. And what you put in your blood really affects what the tissues and cells have to work with. And that's really going to affect the organ system. Different examples of variables that are kind of held to this homeostasis: blood pressure, body temperature, blood glucose levels, fluid volume. And there's this set point theory. There's a it's like your thermostat in your house. You set it to 70 degrees. Gets a little colder, the heater turns on, brings it back up to 70, gets a little hot, shuts it off. And so body temperature, or the cruise control in your car, you set it for 60, but you start going up a hill, so it drops down to 55, which then makes your motor work a little harder to bring it back up to 60, right? So this is this set point theory. And this is all based on the fact that we have receptors that are monitoring normal. What is our set point, right? So it monitors monitors set points. And if it goes up or down, these integration centers, right, are going to then respond. Their response is to an effector. It's going to make something happen, right? So effectors try to right the wrong. It's going to try to fix what's up, what's down. And so this is allowing kind of the receptor and the integrating center to like fix what's right or wrong. And then it'll send a message back saying, we're good, we are back to set point. And so there's two different feedback loops that kind of make this happen. And most all are negative feedback. And what it means by negative, it means shuts off. So that is to say, again, blood sugar levels rise. It's above normal. The integrating center is the beta cells of the pancreas. They're seeing this rise in glucose in the blood. And so it signals to the beta cells to secrete insulin. Insulin then goes to the cells and to take in glucose. So the result is the amount of glucose in the blood goes down because it's now been put into the cells. Goes back to normal, that's going to shut off this from happening. So no more insulin is being secreted. And so the kind of return to normal shuts it off. That's different than positive feedback, where positive feedback is basically the presence. Let me turn it this way. Something present will trigger more of that something to be released. It's a really hard thing to stop. It's like going down a hill. Once you start rolling down the hill, it's hard to get the wheels to stop because they keep going faster and faster and faster. So positive feedback is really, we see it in labor and delivery. We see it in certain hormones, like luteinizing hormone keeps going up. So you have an increase in estrogen secretion until ovulation. Once there's ovulation, this turns off. But again, we don't really talk about positive feedback loops in this class. There really aren't many. So what is the definition of homeostasis? Maintaining a relatively constant environment or condition, internally, externally, body temperature, maintenance of condition to match internal, external. Oh, this was a question. I was like, these don't sound right. Like, what? Like, wait a minute, that's not right. Yes, what is the definition of homeostasis? It's maintaining relatively constant conditions. You could tell we need to end this lecture, right? We've kind of gone over our time. So we're going to get to the end of it, which is introducing diabetes. It's an epidemic, yes. We are talking about diabetes mellitus. Diabetes mellitus is a metabolic disease. It has to do with blood glucose levels, right? They're elevated, they're higher than normal. Higher in blood than normal. And we'll really talk about what normal means. We have so much glucose in our blood that gets filtered out in the nephrons of the kidneys, but we don't have enough transporters to reabsorb it all. So some of that glucose stays in the urine filtrate. That's why there is urine in the glucose. Plasma volumes also are high. And so there's a couple of symptoms: excessive thirst, excessive urination. Those are the two most common. But diabetes mellitus really affects every single organ system. Type 2 diabetes, by the way, is hereditary. And I'll get into the difference between type 1 and type 2. But this is the type that's hereditary. And so you can see different ethnic groups have a higher predisposition to diabetes, which can be problematic. But all ethnicities are not immune. And if you listen to the podcast on mismatched diseases in the beginning of class, we got into diabetes. And really, back early on, the early 1900s, there was essentially no diabetes. Specifically, type 2 did not exist. Around 1985, we started to see an increase. And between 85 and like 2000, it really shot up. And they're like, well, what happened? Our food sources changed, right? We started eating more sugar. Then around 2010-ish, what happened here? Ultra processed food really took over. And so we've really changed what we're eating, and that has really affected diabetes, because diabetes is truly, type 2 diabetes is really a metabolic disease, and it has everything to do with what we're putting in our body and how much of it. So diet is really a big treatment, because diet is one of the things that does cause type 2 diabetes. Maintaining blood glucose levels less than 120 milligrams per deciliter is really essential for not having different organ damage. These are medications to help treat type 2 diabetes. And insulin, type 1. After a while, type 2 diabetics might have to start using insulin as well. Diabetes is expensive. This is why it's actually concerning, not just for people's health, right? Not to just mention the health issues, heart disease, cardiovascular disease, stroke, kidney disease, kidney failure, blindness. These are not great things to have, right? But monetarily, it's like $413 billion a year. And that was in 2022, right? We're now 2024 going on 25. So that's a lot of money every year spent. And most of it is medical costs. Some of it is on lost work and production, earlier death. There's these indirect costs, right? But really closer to home, if you know anyone with type 2 diabetes, they're spending $3,000 to $5,000 a year more than someone who does not have type 2 diabetes, even with health insurance. So it's affecting people, not just health-wise, but in their pocketbook. And so real quick, I'm going to go over, how do we diagnose it? Well, blood sugar levels, of course, but also we're looking at body mass index. Is it perfect? No, but it's one of the things we have right now to kind of take a snapshot of someone's, healthy weight, should we say. So it is a body mass index, or BMI, is body weight in kilogram divided by their height in meters squared. Now, can you have a BMI that's puts you in the overweight category, but you're not fat, you're strong. You're just maybe short and strong, and it gives you a high BMI. So yeah, it's not foolproof. But when people start having BMIs of well over 30 or even over 40, that's not short and strong. That's they weigh too much, and what's causing that weight gain is also leading to type 2 diabetes. So the likelihood of developing type 2 diabetes goes way up when you look at BMI, right? So if you have a BMI of over 30 and over 35, you have a 3 to 6 time more, six-fold increase in having diabetes. And so we find that a high percentage of people with BMIs over 30 do have diabetes or pre-diabetes. So let me just kind of clarify a few things. Type 1 diabetes. This is where the beta cells of the pancreas do not make the hormone insulin, right? Something happens, autoimmune, beta cells stop producing insulin, so they lack insulin. Generally happens in childhood, happens before age 25. It's usually a young person thing. That's type 1 diabetes, have to take insulin. Type 2 diabetes, this is the metabolic. There's an impaired cellular response. Impaired cellular response. Type 2 diabetics have insulin. Beta cells are making it. But insulin is not working. Does not work on cell membrane to allow glucose into cell. So it's really a breakdown on the cellular membrane. It's a function of impaired response at a cellular level. This is diagnosed when you have blood glucose levels over 125 milligrams per deciliter. If you're between 100 to 125, you're pre-diabetic. So almost 80 million Americans right now are pre-diabetic, and they'll likely develop full-blown diabetes in the next 10 years. What can you do to prevent that? It's diet and exercise. Exercise actually increases the cell's ability to take in glucose without insulin. So exercise, this is why exercise is so effective, right? Exercise increases the cell's ability to take in glucose, even if there is insulin impairment. So exercise, diet. There are other types of diabetes. There's gestational diabetes. This really only happens during pregnancy. So it's like type 2 diabetes, but only during pregnancy. Woman delivers, goes back to being normal. So it's may develop it post-pregnancy, but it's marked by being normal, getting pregnant, and having then a type of type 2 diabetes during pregnancy. And then diabetes insipidus, this actually is when the hypothalamus does not produce antidiuretic hormone. And so if you're not producing enough antidiuretic hormone, it's meaning you're diuresing and you're urinating a lot of water out because you're not reabsorbing, right? So it's frequent urination, like diabetes mellitus, but it's due to a totally different hormone imbalance. So summary, diagnosing diabetes, we use fasting blood glucose tests, right? And so if you're over 125, you're diabetic. If you're 100 to 125, and what fasting is no food for 12 hours before the blood test. There's also a blood test called the hemoglobin H1C. There is hemoglobin carries oxygen. They're in your red blood cells. And there's the subunit called A1C. And A1C gets glycosylated, which means the glucose in the blood kind of attaches to this protein subunit A1C. And so the higher the blood glucose levels, the higher the glycosylation of hemoglobin A1C. And so checking hemoglobin A1C really kind of is a snapshot of what the blood glucose levels were for 2 to 3 months. Oops. And so you can see how someone's sugars Are they out of control? Are they really high all the time? Not just right before they go into the doctor's office. It's kind of an overview. Symptoms, main symptoms of diabetes: dehydration. Why? Because you're urinating a lot. Fatigue. Why? You have no energy in your cells. The cells aren't getting any glucose. You're going to have issues with your microvasculature, your heart. You're going to have nervous system disruptions, erectile dysfunction, atherosclerosis. You're also going to be very thirsty. And so drinking a lot, peeing a lot. Drinking a lot, peeing a lot. Okay, so which type of diabetes results from inadequate insulin secretion, not secreting? That's going to be type 1. Versus which is the most common form and its cause? Well, the most common is type 2. Which of the two? It's not this one because insulin's still secreting. So it's due to cells being unable to respond to the insulin to allow glucose into the cell. And so that's going to conclude our first chapter. We will keep rolling along, and I'll see you in chapter 2.